This 1875 photograph of twin brothers looks peaceful until historians uncovered a secret so dark the photo was banned. In the archives of the Ozark Heritage Museum, two 17-year-old twins stand stiffly on their family's farmhouse porch. Elias and Silas Halloway appear to be the picture of rural dignity in their Sunday best. For nearly 80 years, that's all anyone saw. But when a university archivist scanned the image at high resolution in 2011, she discovered something hidden in the reflection of the parlor window behind them: a pale face, a hand pressed desperately against the glass from inside, and across the knuckles dark tally marks, as if someone was counting the days. When she checked the photograph's records, she found a memo from 1952 that banned the image from public display for reasons of community decency. The face belonged to their mother, Anelise Halloway. She wasn't sick, as the family had claimed. She was a prisoner, and her own sons were her jailers. What did this seemingly respectable family do that was so horrific that even decades later their community couldn't bear to look at the evidence? If this story has sparked your interest in the hidden truths of history, consider subscribing to our channel to help keep hidden histories alive, and comment your city and local time. In the archives of the Ozark Heritage Museum in Stone County, Missouri, there is a photograph from 1875. At first glance, it seems perfectly ordinary for its time. It shows two young men, perhaps 17 years old, standing on the wooden porch of a farmhouse. They are identical twins, Elias and Silas Halloway. They stand stiffly in their Sunday best, their faces betraying no emotion, their hands clasped behind their backs in the formal manner expected of young men being photographed. The house behind them is simple but well kept, with white-painted clapboard siding and a sturdy stone foundation. The porch floorboards appear freshly swept, and a pair of rocking chairs sit neatly positioned against the wall. It appears to be a portrait of quiet, rural dignity, a testament to a hard-working family making their way in the Missouri Hill Country. For nearly 80 years, that is all anyone saw. The Halloway family was known to their neighbors in Stone County as stern but respectable landowners. They kept to themselves, as many farming families did in those days, but they were regarded as honest folk who paid their debts and minded their own business. The father, Orville Halloway, was a man of rigid principles and unwavering religious conviction. He was tall and lean, with deep-set eyes and a beard that he kept meticulously trimmed. Those who knew him described him as someone who spoke little, but commanded attention when he did speak. His word was his bond, they said, and he expected the same unwavering commitment to truth and duty from his family. The twins, Elias and Silas, were inseparable and known throughout the community for their tireless work ethic. They moved with an unusual synchronization, as if they shared a single mind, and neighbors often remarked on how they seemed to communicate without speaking. They were quiet young men who showed proper respect to their elders and never caused trouble in town. When they came to the general store or attended church services, they stood close together, their identical faces wearing expressions of solemn concentration. The townspeople respected them as dutiful sons who clearly honored their father and understood the value of hard work. Their mother, Anelise Halloway, was spoken of as a frail woman, often unwell and rarely seen in town. The few neighbors who remembered her from the early days of the family's residence described her as gentle and soft-spoken, with kind eyes and a delicate constitution. She had been a pretty woman in her youth, they recalled, but childbirth and the hardships of farm life seemed to have taken their toll on her health. Orville would explain her absence from church services and social gatherings by mentioning her recurring bouts of illness, her need for rest and quiet. The community accepted this explanation without question, as it was not uncommon for women in those days to suffer from various ailments that kept them confined to their homes. The Halloway farm itself was a model of efficiency and order. The fields were always properly tended, the livestock healthy and well-fed, the outbuildings maintained in excellent repair. Orville ran his operation with military precision, and his sons followed his lead without question. Visitors to the farm, though few were invited, always commented on the pristine condition of everything they saw. The house was kept spotless, the yard free of debris, even the chicken coop painted and organized. It was clear that this was a family that took pride in their work and their reputation. The photograph was taken by a traveling photographer who made his rounds through the Missouri countryside each summer, documenting families for posterity. The Halloway twins had posed for him on what appeared to be a pleasant afternoon in late spring or early summer. The light was good, the shadows soft, and the composition straightforward and dignified. It was exactly the sort of portrait that would have hung with pride on a parlor wall or been sent to distant relatives as proof of the family's prosperity and respectability. But in 2011, nearly 140 years after that photograph was taken, Dr. Lena Petrova sat at her desk in the university's Digital Archives laboratory, methodically scanning the museum's historical collection. She was a meticulous woman, trained in the latest preservation techniques, and she approached each item with the careful attention it deserved. When she loaded the Halloway photograph into her high-resolution scanner, she expected nothing more than another routine digitization of a 19th-century family portrait. The scanner's software, however, flagged an anomaly. Modern digital enhancement could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, and as Dr. Petrova zoomed in on the image, magnifying it far beyond what the original photographer could have imagined possible, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Behind the twins, reflected faintly in the rippled glass of the parlor window, was a distorted image that should not have been there. It was the pale, hollow face of a woman, her mouth open as if crying out. But it was not the face that made Dr. Petrova's hands tremble as she adjusted the digital enhancement. It was what appeared next to it, the unmistakable shape of a hand pressed desperately against the glass from inside the house. The fingers were unnaturally thin, almost skeletal, and across the knuckles were dark straight lines that looked deliberate and methodical, not scratches or accidents, but what appeared to be tally marks, as if someone was keeping count of something terrible. Intrigued and deeply unsettled by what she had discovered, Dr. Petrova carefully checked the photograph's accession card. It was a simple index card from 1952, when the photo had been donated to the museum by a distant Halloway relative. The handwriting was neat and official, listing basic details about the image, the date, the subjects, and the donor's name. But stapled to the back was a folded yellowed memo from the County Historical Board, also dated 1952. Dr. Petrova unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the brief but chilling message. Regarding Item 41B, Portrait of Halloway Twins. By unanimous vote, this item is to be removed from public display. Its exhibition is deemed a disservice to community memory and decency. Store in deep archive. The memo was signed by 3 board members, their names now faded but still legible. This discovery sent Dr. Petrova on a deeper investigation into the Halloway family records, which had been donated to the museum along with the photograph. The collection included several boxes of documents that had apparently sat untouched for decades. She began with the most substantial item, a large leather-bound book that had served as the farm and a household ledger kept by the family patriarch, Orville Halloway, from 1870 through 1895. The binding was cracked with age and the pages had turned yellow, but Orville's careful handwriting remained clear and readable. The early pages were exactly what one would expect from a meticulous farmer's records. Orville had documented everything: crop yields by season, livestock sales, purchases of supplies and equipment, weather patterns, and the costs of repairs and improvements to the property. His entries were methodical and businesslike, revealing a man who understood that successful farming required careful attention to detail and precise record-keeping. There were notes about the best varieties of corn for the local soil, observations about which fields produced the highest yields, and detailed accounts of every penny spent and earned. But in the winter of 1873, something changed. The entries became different, more personal, and increasingly disturbing. Mixed in with mundane notes about fence posts and seed prices, Orville began writing about his wife Anelise in language that grew progressively more troubling. He described what he called her spiritual malady and wrote ominously about the serpent sickness in her blood. These were not the words of a concerned husband documenting his wife's illness. They were the writings of a man who had begun to see his wife as something dangerous, something that needed to be contained. The entries revealed that Orville had become convinced that Anelise was spiritually corrupted, possessed by what he described as unholy desires and wicked thoughts that threatened the moral purity of their household. He wrote extensively about his duty as the head of the family to cleanse his own house and protect his sons from what he saw as their mother's malevolent influence. Most disturbing of all, he began to reference obscure and radical religious texts that he interpreted as divine mandates for extreme action. By the spring of 1874, Orville's entries described the construction of what he called a place of quiet penitence for Anelise. He wrote about building this space in the root cellar beneath their house, describing it as necessary to protect her from the world, and the world from her affliction. The language he used was clinical and matter-of-fact, as if he were documenting any other farm improvement project. But the details he recorded painted a horrifying picture of systematic preparation for imprisonment. To corroborate what she was reading in the ledger, Dr. Petrova began searching through county financial records from the same period. What she found confirmed her worst fears about Orville's intentions. In November of 1873, she discovered a bill of sale from the town blacksmith for an unusual order placed by Orville Halloway. The itemized receipt listed 1 heavy iron door bolt, interior slide only, 2 oversized iron hinges, and 1 custom-forged window grill, small. The measurements provided for the window grill matched exactly the dimensions of the small, high window that would have provided the only light to the farmhouse's root cellar. This was not the order of a man building a place of healing or temporary confinement for a sick family member. These were the materials needed to create a prison, complete with a door that could only be opened from the outside and a window too small and too high for anyone inside to reach. The blacksmith's records even noted that Orville had requested the bolt mechanism be made extra strong and had paid a premium for the heaviest iron available. Dr. Petrova also found a separate purchase order from the local lumber mill, dated just days after the blacksmith's bill. Orville had bought thick wooden planks, iron nails, and what the invoice described as cellar reinforcement materials. When she cross-referenced these purchases with the layout of the Halloway farmhouse, which had been documented in a property survey from 1891, the evidence became undeniable. Orville Halloway had not built a sick room or a place of care for his wife. He had systematically constructed a cell beneath his own house, designed to hold a human being against her will for an indefinite period of time. The most chilling discovery came when Dr. Petrova turned her attention to how Orville wrote about his twin sons in the months following Anelise's confinement. The entries revealed a systematic transformation of Elias and Silas from beloved children into instruments of their father's twisted will. Beginning in early 1874, Orville stopped referring to them by their given names in his ledger. Instead, he began calling them the Vindicators or the Guardians of the Gate, titles that carried an ominous religious significance in his increasingly warped worldview. Orville's entries described in disturbing detail how he had molded his 17-year-old sons into enforcers of what he called divine justice. He wrote extensively about their spiritual education, documenting how he had convinced them that their mother's confinement was not only necessary, but sacred. According to his records, he spent hours each evening reading to them from obscure religious texts, interpreting passages about filial duty and paternal authority in ways that justified the unthinkable. The twins, he noted with satisfaction, had accepted their role without question or hesitation, demonstrating what he saw as proof of their moral strength and spiritual purity. The ledger contained what Orville called the Schedule of Cleansing, a methodical plan that outlined the twins' duties in maintaining their mother's imprisonment. Under headings that used euphemistic religious language, he detailed a weekly routine of what he termed intercessions and purification rituals to be carried out by his sons. The language was deliberately obscure, couched in biblical references and theological justifications, but the implications were unmistakable. Orville had created a system of ritualized abuse, and he had trained his own children to be its primary administrators. Most disturbing were the entries that revealed how completely the twins had internalized their father's teachings. Orville wrote with pride about their unwavering dedication to duty and their understanding of the sacred nature of their burden. He described how they approached their assigned tasks with what he called righteous solemnity, never questioning his instructions or showing any sign of doubt about the righteousness of their actions. In his twisted logic, their willing participation proved that God himself approved of what the family was doing to Anelise. Dr. Petrova found evidence that the twins' involvement went far beyond simply following orders. Orville's ledger included what appeared to be suggestions and improvements to the schedule that had come from Elias and Silas themselves. They had, according to their father's proud documentation, become active participants in designing and refining the system of their mother's torment. Orville wrote that they demonstrated innovation in service of purification and showed natural aptitude for the work of salvation. Determined to understand whether anyone in the community had noticed what was happening at the Halloway farm, Dr. Petrova expanded her research to include local newspaper archives and the records of institutions the family had been connected to. Her most significant discovery came from the private journal of Reverend Marcus Abernathy, who had served as pastor of the Presbyterian church the Halloways attended. His personal diary, preserved in the church's historical records, contained a deeply troubling account of a visit he had made to the Halloway farm in the summer of 1874. Reverend Abernathy had gone to the farm to inquire about Anelise's prolonged absence from church services. What he found there clearly disturbed him profoundly. In his diary, he described Orville as speaking with a fire in his eyes that seemed more worldly than divine about his wife's fallen state and corrupt nature. Most significantly, Orville had told the pastor that only he and his sons possessed the spiritual authority and moral strength to perform the necessary penance that would save Anelise's soul from damnation. The pastor's account revealed that he had asked to see Anelise to offer her spiritual comfort in her time of illness. Orville had refused, claiming that her condition made her unfit for contact with outsiders and that exposing others to her spiritual contamination would be a sin against God. When Reverend Abernathy pressed the issue, suggesting that Christian charity demanded he be allowed to minister to a suffering member of his congregation, Orville had grown angry and accused the pastor of failing to understand the true nature of divine justice. Most damning of all was the pastor's description of the twins during this visit. He wrote that Elias and Silas had stood silent throughout the conversation, But their behavior had been deeply unsettling. They had, he noted, watched their father with what seemed like reverent attention, nodding approvingly at his most extreme statements about their mother's supposed spiritual corruption. When the pastor attempted to speak directly to them about their mother's well-being, they had responded only with what he described as rehearsed phrases about divine will and paternal wisdom. Reverend Abernathy left the Halloway farm that day profoundly shaken. His final diary entry about the visit was brief but telling. "The Halloway house is no longer a house of God. I fear for the soul of that poor woman, but I fear even more for the souls of those who keep her." Despite his obvious concern and his clear understanding that something terrible was happening, the pastor took no further action. His subsequent diary entries revealed his struggle with what he saw as a conflict between his pastoral duty and his respect for paternal authority. In the end, his fear of challenging a powerful community member and his adherence to the social conventions of his time prevented him from intervening to save a woman's life. Dr. Petrova's investigation reached its most devastating conclusion when she located the official records surrounding Anelise Halloway's death. What she discovered in the county clerk's archives represented the final, most damning piece of evidence in a crime that had been perfectly concealed for over a century. Anelise's death certificate, filed in March of 1888, told a story of systematic deception that had allowed her tormentors to escape justice completely. The document listed the cause of death as wasting sickness, a vague diagnosis that was commonly used in the 19th century to describe any condition that caused gradual physical decline. For most families of that era, such a designation would have been unremarkable, even expected for a woman who had been reportedly ill for many years. But what made Anelise's death certificate extraordinary was not what it said, but who had signed it. The attending physician was listed not as the town doctor, but as Orville Halloway himself. A handwritten note at the bottom of the certificate, added by the county clerk, provided the crucial detail that exposed the full extent of the deception. No physician present at time of passing. Cause of death attested by husband as head of household. This notation revealed that Anelise's death had been entirely self-certified by the very man who had held her prisoner for 15 years. Orville had simply walked into the county office, reported his wife's death from natural causes, and received official documentation without any independent verification or investigation. Dr. Petrova's research into 19th century legal procedures revealed that this was not uncommon in rural Missouri during that period. The death of a woman on an isolated farm, particularly one who had been reportedly ill for years, rarely warranted official scrutiny. County clerks routinely accepted the word of male heads of household, especially those with good reputations in the community. The system that was designed to protect families from intrusive government oversight had instead provided perfect cover for murder. Even more disturbing was what the death certificate did not contain. There was no mention of any symptoms preceding Anelise's death, no description of her final illness, and no indication that anyone other than her immediate family had seen her in her final months or years. The document was stark in its brevity, as if Orville had been careful to provide only the minimum information required by law. The date of death was listed simply as March 15, 1888, with no time specified and no details about the circumstances. When Dr. Petrova cross-referenced this date with Orville's ledger entries, she found that his final references to the schedule of cleansing appeared just weeks before Anelise's official death. His last entry about her, dated February 28, 1888, was chillingly matter-of-fact. The vessel has grown too weak to continue the purification process. The Lord's will approaches completion. There was no mention of illness, no expression of grief or concern, only cold documentation of what appeared to be the final phase of a calculated murder. The score marks that Dr. Petrova had first noticed in the reflection of the parlor window now took on an even more horrifying significance. If Anelise had indeed been marking the passage of time during her 15 years of captivity, those faint scratches on the glass represented not just days or months, but potentially thousands of individual moments of desperation and hope. Each mark was evidence of a woman fighting to maintain her sanity and her sense of time in a world designed to strip away every aspect of her humanity. Dr. Petrova's efforts to understand the full scope of the cover-up led her to examine the town doctor's records from the same period. Dr. Samuel Morrison had served Stone County for over 40 years, and his patient logs were remarkably complete and detailed. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions about the community's complicity in Anelise's fate. The last entry for Anelise Halloway in Dr. Morrison's records was dated November 3, 1872, more than 15 years before her official death. The entry noted treatment for a broken wrist and mentioned that the injury appeared to have been caused by a fall. After that single entry, Anelise Halloway completely disappeared from the medical records of Stone County. There were no subsequent visits, no prescriptions, no house calls, and no documentation of any kind until Dr. Petrova found a brief note in Dr. Morrison's files from 1888. The note, written in the doctor's careful handwriting, simply stated, "Informed by O. Halloway of wife's passing from wasting sickness. Did not attend. Family declined services." The clinical brevity of this notation suggested that Dr. Morrison had accepted Orville's explanation without question, never wondering why he had not been called to treat a supposedly dying woman or why a family that had once sought his services had suddenly stopped doing so. Determined to understand whether any members of the Halloway family's extended network had suspected the truth, Dr. Petrova began searching for correspondence and personal documents that might have survived in other collections. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a cache of letters that had been preserved in the papers of a distant Halloway cousin who had died in the 1930s. Among these documents was a letter written by Anelise's sister, Margaret, who lived in St. Louis and had maintained sporadic correspondence with the family through the 1870s. Margaret's letter, dated June 12, 1874, was addressed to Anelise, but had apparently been returned unopened. The envelope bore a notation in Orville's handwriting, "Addressee too unwell for correspondence." Margaret's words provided heartbreaking evidence of a sister's growing concern and confusion about her sibling's sudden silence. She wrote, "Dearest Anelise, I have not heard from you in so many months, and my heart grows heavy with worry. Orville writes back only that you are too unwell for visitors or letters, but this is so unlike you. Even in your worst times, you have always found strength to write a few words. I pray that God grants you healing soon, but I confess that I do not understand why you cannot at least dictate a brief message to ease my fears." This letter provided crucial evidence that Anelise's isolation had been complete and systematic. Her own sister, who had known her intimately and corresponded with her regularly, had been cut off entirely from any contact. The fact that Orville had returned the letter unopened suggested that he was determined to prevent any outside communication that might have revealed the truth about his wife's circumstances or given her an opportunity to call for help. Spurred by the weight of her discoveries, Dr. Petrova made the decision to contact living members of the Halloway family line. Through genealogical research, she located several descendants of the twins' cousins who still lived in Missouri and Arkansas. Her initial attempts at contact were met with polite but guarded responses. The Halloway name, while not prominent, was still remembered in the region, and the family's reputation for quiet respectability had persisted through generations of carefully maintained silence. Her breakthrough came when she reached out to an elderly man named Thomas Halloway, the great-great-nephew of the twins, who lived in a retirement community in Springfield, Missouri. Thomas was 83 years old, sharp-minded, and initially protective of his family's legacy. When Dr. Petrova first contacted him, he was reluctant to discuss what he called old family business with a stranger. But when she shared copies of the documents she had uncovered, explaining the historical significance of her research, his resistance gradually gave way to shocked recognition of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for more than a century. During their second conversation, conducted over the phone on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in November of 2011, Thomas revealed the family story that had been passed down through whispered conversations for generations. The narrative that had survived in the family's oral tradition was carefully sanitized, designed to preserve the reputation of the dead while providing a plausible explanation for troubling rumors that had never quite died away. According to the version Thomas had inherited from his grandmother, Great-Aunt Anelise had gone mad after the birth of her twins, becoming dangerous to herself and others. The family story, as Thomas recounted it, painted Orville as a long-suffering husband who had made the difficult decision to keep his mentally ill wife confined for her own protection and the safety of his children. The twins, in this sanitized version, were devoted sons who had sacrificed their own happiness to help their father care for a woman who could no longer care for herself. The narrative emphasized the family's Christian duty and portrayed their actions as both necessary and compassionate, a tragic situation handled with as much dignity as possible under impossible circumstances. Thomas described how this story had shaped his family's understanding of their heritage for decades. The Halloways had always spoken of Orville with respect, remembering him as a man who had faced a terrible burden with stoic determination. The twins were remembered as dutiful sons who had never married because they had devoted their lives to their family obligations. Even Anelise was recalled with a kind of pitying affection, portrayed as a gentle soul who had been broken by forces beyond anyone's control. But as Dr. Petrova shared the evidence she had uncovered, reading excerpts from Orville's ledger and describing the construction details she had found in the county records, Thomas's voice began to change. The comfortable narrative that had explained away decades of family secrecy crumbled in the face of documented evidence that revealed a far more sinister reality. The man who had begun their conversation defending his ancestors' reputation found himself confronting the possibility that his family's history was built on a foundation of lies designed to conceal an unspeakable crime. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult Dr. Petrova had ever conducted in her career as a historian. Thomas struggled to reconcile the evidence with everything he had believed about his family's past. He asked detailed questions about the documents, seeking alternative explanations that might preserve some vestige of the story he had inherited. But as each piece of evidence was examined and explained, the horrible truth became undeniable. The great-aunt he had been taught to pity as a victim of mental illness had actually been the victim of a calculated campaign of imprisonment, abuse, and murder orchestrated by her own husband and children. Thomas's initial shock gave way to a deeper horror as the full implications of the discovery became clear. He realized that his entire extended family had unknowingly perpetuated a lie for generations, honoring the memory of men who deserved only condemnation. The family pride that had sustained them through difficult times was revealed to be based on a myth created to hide one of the most monstrous crimes imaginable. Every family gathering where Orville's strength had been praised, every story about the twins' devotion, every expression of sympathy for poor, mad Anelise had been an unwitting continuation of the cover-up that had protected her killers from justice. In the weeks that followed their initial conversation, Thomas worked with Dr. Petrova to contact other family members and share what had been discovered. the response was mixed, with some relatives refusing to believe the evidence and others experiencing the same devastating realization that Thomas had faced. Several family members chose to distance themselves from the revelations entirely, unwilling to confront the possibility that their ancestors had been capable of such evil. But others, like Thomas, felt a moral obligation to ensure that the truth was finally acknowledged and that Anelise's memory was honored rather than buried beneath layers of comfortable lies. The process of sharing these discoveries with the Halloway descendants revealed how thoroughly the original cover-up had succeeded. For more than a century, a story of family devotion and tragic mental illness had masked a crime that would have shocked even the relatively tolerant standards of 19th-century rural justice. The narrative had been so carefully constructed and so persistently maintained that it had become family gospel, accepted without question by people who had no reason to doubt the integrity of their ancestors. Only now, confronted with irrefutable documentary evidence, were they forced to acknowledge that their family's greatest source of pride had actually been their greatest shame.